Okay, hello everybody. Today we're going to talk briefly about feminism. Give a little, just kind of summary of some of its core ideas, some of the things in it, maybe some of the contentions around it. Next video we're going to be talking about Nell Noddig's care ethics in particular. But yeah, today we're going to be talking mostly about feminism. So, feminism, is actually a relatively new new ideal, and it sprung up in the 20th century, really as a political wave. Now there were feminists before this time. Female writers. Mary Wollstonecraft is a great example of a female writer who was writing on behalf of women, on behalf of femininity. But really, in the 20th century is when it took off. At the beginning of the 20th century, with the suffragettes fighting for women's right to vote and own property. And the typical talking points about feminism is that it's sort of experienced three waves: the 1920 suffragettes, and then again in the 1940s. With like Simone de Beauvoir and a lot of the French feminists, and then again now in this era we're seeing another resurgence, a third wave of feminism. Yeah, maybe that kind of started in the 90s, has been going on to now. That second wave kind of started in the 40s and went into like 60s, 70s. So anyway, that's just kind of a general history. Now, the thing that they all share in common, even though they were fighting for very different things in their particular moments, the thing that they're all sharing is they're seeking equal rights, equal treatment, equality in general for women. Now, what that exactly means, especially in this like new wave, this third wave or whatever, is a little bit different. Who's included in that and what kind of rights they're fighting for is a little bit different among each wave. But overall, that's sort of what they have in common. They kind of draw from the same source, the same pool of thinkers, and they have similar goals. So anyway, all that to say, feminism is definitely a real and important political, social, and cultural movement that's been happening for about a century, maybe more, depending on where you mark it now. However, we kind of want to take a look at it in the same way that we have been looking at the rest of these ethic philosophies. Speaking of feminism, I guess one of my hens here just popped up to say hello. Anyway, we want to understand how hello, chicken. On this side, we want to understand how feminists would make moral decisions, right? How is a feminist going to decide whether having a sandwich or suing their father or whatever it is, pulling the lever on the trolley problem? How is a feminist going to evaluate those moral situations? That's how we're going to kind of be looking at this sort of thing, because it's a different angle than what we're mostly used to. So your book starts with Carol Gilligan's sort of psychology, psychomoral research study in the 1970s, where she interviewed a group of students, boys and girls, and she asked them moral questions. And she asked them how they would answer and think about these moral questions. And she found that all of the students were able to morally reason the way that we have been here, where we think of abstract principles or we use calculations. We try to find a sort of like neutral ground in order to evaluate, right? She found that all the students were capable of that. But she found that it was only her female students, not all of them, but only the female students, who would consider the relationships, who would not try to necessarily pull back and become neutral or abstract, but would instead consider the relatedness of the individuals in the example. Your textbooks has some good examples. It talks about, for example, asking a boy and a girl about their religious beliefs. What if they had different religious beliefs than their parents? What would they do? And the boy said, well, it's my right, to have my own opinion, and I'm allowed to have that. And that's true, right? But that's relying on abstract principles such as rights in order to determine what is good or bad. Whereas the girl responded, well, how would my parents feel? How would that affect my relationship with my mom? Maybe I don't want to like disrespect her. Maybe I can have these beliefs, but I need to, have them in a certain way in order to care for my parents best. And that's a very different way of thinking about what is right and wrong. It's not necessarily based on abstract principles, but it's based on relationships with people that you have. So via this, Carol Gilligan talks about something called the female moral perspective. which is essentially the opposite of the male moral perspective. The male moral perspective is about, again, attaining neutrality, about trying to discern abstract principles using logic, reason, rationality, etc., etc. Whereas the female moral perspective is not about distancing yourself from the situation in order to examine it, but rather being inside the situation and considering things from the context of relatedness. So this begs the question, is there actually a difference between male and female morality? And if there is a real difference between male and female morality, what is the source of that difference? So anyway, first of all, it's debatable whether this so-called feminine morality even exists, whether it is actually real or not. And this is debated by feminists as well. There are, especially modern day feminists, who are not sure that this feminist morality is a real thing or not, and whether it ends up actually hurting the goals of feminism as a project to bring equality to women. Distinguishing between male and female moralities, that might not be effective to help that initial political goal, right? But let's say that let's say that somehow we can do the empirical research, do more even than Carol Gilligan did, and determine, yeah, there are differences between the way that men and the way that women reason. We would still have to ask, where does that come from? And a lot of the answers that we get for that are along the same lines as the conversation that we have all probably had with somebody at least once in our life, which is nature versus nurture, right? If there is a moral difference between the genders, is it a natural phenomenon? Is it something that just kind of arises because of, our biology, the way that we are? Or is it because of the ways that we treat boys and girls in our culture? But to divide it between nature and nurture only is a little bit too simplistic. Your textbook actually gives 3 alternatives for an explanation for the source of differences in morality between the genders, or differences between moral reasoning in the genders. The first one is psychosexual. It's more of a Freudian thing. In this Freudian sort of sense of understanding the difference between gender morality, we see the distinction between the psychological development of males and females. Males are separate from their mothers, their main nurturers. They're separate from their mothers, whereas females are closer to their mothers, their main nurturers. And so this leads to independence versus dependence, and 2 very different kinds of moral reasoning. And so this is kind of a nurture, but also nature. I don't know how you would distinguish that, right? This is kind of a nurture/nature way of understanding the source of the difference between the morality of the genders. Another way to understand it maybe is the biology. Maybe our reproductive organs themselves, the main difference between males and females, right, determine whether or not we have this male perspective or female perspective, right? A lot of people nowadays would probably frame it in terms of estrogen and testosterone, maybe. Your book frames it in the capacity to bear children. Maybe that's a source of the moral differences. And the last potential difference that your book identifies are the social cultural practices, the way that we treat boys and girls differently, our different expectations of them. The fact that we expect girls to eventually be mothers and boys to go work, and all these sorts of things, right? Another issue that we run into in believing that there are a difference between the way that genders can morally reason is we need to then decide which one's superior, right? If the feminine way of moral reasoning is this one specific way, maybe it's better than the masculine way. We're going to talk about Nell Nodding's care ethics in the next video, but maybe her way of doing ethics, her feminine way of doing ethics, is much better than the so-called masculine way. Or maybe they're both good. Maybe we actually just need more of this feminine ethic in our moral reasoning. Maybe we've been too focused on this so-called masculine ethic. That's a possibility as well. Not all feminists are on board with this way of understanding gender, though. Judith Butler, a contemporary philosopher, she's still around right now. She's very famous for a lot of different works. One of her most famous works, though, is Gender Trouble. And Judith Butler argues that gender is not so much biological or like cultural, although she kind of sees those things. Rather, gender is a performance. Gender is a part of our identity, and gender is a way of displaying ourselves. Gender more than anything is an act that we do. It's a thing that we do for everyone around us. So if that's the case, if gender's a performance, if gender's sort of part of the way that we display ourselves, that has a very different angle for moral reasoning, for gender moral reasoning, than what we've been talking about before. Anyway, this is a tricky subject, obviously. But I'm interested to hear what you guys think. Is there a difference between the genders and their ability to morally reason? Yeah, if so, where does that come from? Or maybe gender is sort of maybe more of a performance. Not that it's not real, but rather it's not as concrete. It's not as absolute as we tend to think it is. Maybe there isn't a moral reasoning difference between the genders. Maybe the masculine way of thinking about ethics is the way that we should be doing things, and we shouldn't be letting our emotions, our feelings, the so-called feminine modes of understanding ethics interfere with us. I don't know. It's interesting. I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say.